Hi, so this is an overview of Sonnet 43 by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It's one of the poems in your English literature anthology. So I'm just going to give you a bit of context and then a run through of what the poem means. So who wrote this poem? Well, the author of Sonnet 43 was Victorian poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she was born in 1806 and she died in 1861. She was from a wealthy background and born into a wealthy family. She was educated at home, and even though she was a girl, her parents encouraged her to study, which was incredibly unusual for the time, but it was a really good thing. She was highly intelligent, she loved to study, and there are reports of Elizabeth as a 10-year-old reading Shakespeare, and then there are also reports of her choosing to learn Hebrew so that she could read the Old Testament in its original language. So incredibly bright, incredibly studious, but she suffered from really poor health. She experienced terrible health with her lungs, and then later she fell off a horse and gained a spinal injury. So the poor girl spent quite a lot of time cooped up indoors being ill. But it wasn't only illness that was a difficulty for her. She experienced quite a lot of deaths in her family. Her mother died when she was only 22. And then one of her brothers, who she was incredibly close to, Edward, was drowned 10 years after her mother died when she was only 32. So she suffered deeply from these deaths, and they left a really deep mark on her. And this kind of comes out in her poetry. The grief she experienced is poured into her poetry, and you can really tell that she's been affected by it. In her mid-20s, Elizabeth was becoming a successful poet. She was becoming recognised for her poems, to the point where this man here with a strange beard noticed her. He noticed her poems and he liked them. And he wrote a letter to her and he said to her, "I love your verses with all my heart, Miss..." I love your verses with all my heart, Miss Barrett." And this was Robert Browning, a famous poet, or a poet, and you guessed it, this was the start of a love affair between Elizabeth and Robert, a start of a romantic relationship. And hope, you kind of wish that they'd just sort of live happily ever after, this literary couple, but things are never that simple. And Elizabeth's father, who was incredibly controlling, had asserted that none of his children could marry. He'd forbidden his children to marry. And so Elizabeth knew that she had to keep her relationship with Robert a secret. And so they were forced to communicate with each other just through letters. And they were so deeply in love that they wrote over 574 letters to one another. And as this love affair progressed, Elizabeth obviously decided that she wanted to marry Robert. And in 1846, she made quite a brave decision, really, to marry Robert against her father's wishes. And so they got married in secret. And perhaps you've guessed it, when her father found out, he was absolutely furious. He never ever spoke to her again. He cut her out of his will. She was basically dead to him. And so throughout all of her poems, throughout a lot of her sonnets, this man here, Robert, is featured as a kind of saviour figure. He's the man that has rescued Elizabeth from her harsh and tyrannical father. And so she loved him deeply for it. So why did Elizabeth write this particular poem? Why did she write Sonnet 43? Well, it was written by Elizabeth during the years of her love affair with Robert. It was written before she married him. So it's about that intense love she experienced for him before their marriage. And even though we're studying just this one poem by Elizabeth, it's actually part of a much bigger collection of poems that were published all together, called Sonnets from the Portuguese. And Elizabeth originally didn't want to publish them. Robert was the one who'd persuaded her to publish them. They were written as private poems to him, but he managed to persuade her to publish them. But she agreed under the agreement that she wouldn't put a name to them. So she called them Sonnets from the Portuguese, perhaps to make them sound foreign, to make them sound like they weren't her poems, basically, to protect her identity. But Sonnets from the Portuguese also has a private meaning behind it, which you'd never know about unless you knew that Robert used to call Elizabeth my little Portuguese. That was his private nickname for her, so to speak, because she had quite a dark complexion, which is where the my little Portuguese phrase comes from. So if you translate that, sonnet means a love poem, and Portuguese is referring to Elizabeth. So perhaps sonnets from the Portuguese could actually be understood to mean love poems by, or love poems from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So this poem uses quite a lot of old-fashioned language, which might be tricky to start with. So what is it basically all about? Well, it's like a conversation, really, and perhaps Elizabeth is reimagining a conversation that she's actually had with Robert. Sorry. Perhaps he's actually playfully asked her this very question: how do you love me, Elizabeth? And that has resulted in her telling him all of the many different ways in which she loves him. Or perhaps it's an internal conversation, and a conversation that's only ever happened in Elizabeth's head. Perhaps she's challenged herself to think of how she loves Robert, why she loves Robert, and that's led her to mentally list all the different forms that her love for him takes. So how is this poem structured? Well, we've already said that it's a sonnet, and hopefully you will remember that a sonnet is a 14-line poem, and it's typically around the theme of love. So a sonnet is a 14-line love poem. This poem is an Italian sonnet. It's called a Petrarchan sonnet, named after this man here with a funny leafy headband, called Petrarch. So it's a Petrarchan sonnet. Well, what on earth, you might ask, is a Petrarchan sonnet? Well, a Petrarchan sonnet is basically structured using the octave. So the octave is the first 8 lines, followed by a sestet, which is the final 6 lines. And so in this particular poem, in the octave, Barrett Browning defines her love in the present. She talks about the love she has here and now for Robert. However, then in the sestet, she looks backwards to her childhood, and she explains that her beloved has replaced all of the things that used to capture her heart in her youth. So all the things that she used to love in her childhood, Robert now has replaced those. He's even better. But in the sestet, not only does she look back to her childhood, but she looks forward to the future. And she says that her love will continue even after she's dead. So the Petrarchan sonnet provides a structure that enables her to say that her love can't be restricted by time. It's present, her love is here and now for Robert. It stretches back into the past, and it also stretches forwards into the future. So her love really is timeless. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what each line means. So I'm just going to talk through each line, picking out a few of the key phrases and words. So the poem opens with this question: how do I love thee? And this response of let me count the ways, in particular that word ways, signposts us to the fact that there are lots of different ways of loving somebody else. And this is what the speaker is going to list for us in the rest of the sonnet. It's basically a list of the different ways that she loves him. So this first line of this slide anyway, I love thee to the depth and breadth and height. So in answering that initial question, the speaker uses a spatial metaphor. It basically just means a metaphor relating to space to define the sheer size of her love. So her love, she's saying, is deep, it's broad, it's wide, and it's high. It's 3-dimensional, just like this image here. So it's almost like an image of the poet stretching out her arms to show the reader that her partner means everything to her. The partner means the whole world to her. And then we move on to this word soul. Well, the word soul tells us that Elizabeth's love for Robert is not just physical, it's spiritual. And this really does fit in with the fact that before they were married, they had to keep their relationship secret. They weren't able to spend time together. They physically weren't in close proximity to one another. And because they were having to keep their love hidden from Elizabeth's father, they had to communicate, they had to express their love using letters, words and poems. So their love really was kept on that spiritual level. So yeah, she's just basically saying, my love for you, it's not just physical, it is spiritual. And then this phrase here, feeling out of sight. Well, the words out of sight suggests that her love is so big, it's so vast, that it can't be seen or reached. And then we move, let's just zoom in a bit closer, the ends of being. Well, the ends of being, the word being could be talking about Elizabeth's being, her soul, her body, and it could be suggesting that her love fills the very edges of her being, of her soul, to the point of overflowing. So she's literally, physically, spiritually overflowing with love for Robert. Alternatively, I think ends of being could refer to the end of time, end of being, end of time, perhaps suggesting that her love is eternal and it will just quite simply never end. And then we get this religious word, this religious language at the end of the line, this word grace, which is featured quite a lot in the Christian faith. And grace is basically a word in the Christian faith that describes a gift that is not deserved. So it could be an actual physical gift, or it could refer to a gift like love, which you haven't earned. So ideal grace in this poem could refer to a type of love, a gift, that is freely given, love that you've not done anything special to earn. It's unconditional love. So perhaps Elizabeth is saying she loves Robert unconditionally. He doesn't need to earn her love. He doesn't need to do anything like the dishes before that she shows that she loves him. She loves him no matter what. Okay, and then we get to I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need. Well, notice this constant repetition of I love thee, I love thee, I love thee. I'm sure you've noticed it. And the fact that this phrase is repeated at the start of many of the lines is called anaphora. So where a phrase is repeated at the start of a line is anaphora. And the effect of this is that it just really drives home the intensity of the poet's love. I mean, we can't quibble with the fact that she definitely loves him. We know that. She keeps reasserting it. And then we move on to this slightly more tricky phrase, to the level of every day's most quiet need. And this is just basically telling us about that day-to-day, that everyday type of love. So it's not the kind of flashy love where you buy someone a car to show that you love them, or you buy someone like a designer watch. No, it's more like the everyday signs of love, like seeing your partner's a bit tired and making them a cup of tea, or watching TV together as a couple, or giving your partner a lift somewhere. It's those everyday, unremarkable acts of love that glue you together as a couple that Barrett Browning is discussing here. And then at the end of the line we've got the words sun and candlelight, reinforcing that the speaker loves her beloved both day and night. Her love is constant. And so really these two lines are discussing an everyday constant love. Okay, and then we move on to I love thee freely as men strive for right. Well, the first bit hopefully is pretty easy. I love thee freely shows that the speaker's love is freely chosen. She's not been forced into this relationship. She's not been forced into a marriage. She has chosen this man. And this line also is a simile, and this is where it gets a bit more tricky. So she's comparing loving him freely to men trying to do the right thing, men striving for right. So basically, when you try and do the right thing here, so men strive for right, when you're trying to do the right thing, you're making a free choice. So, you know, in the classroom, when you're choosing to do what the teacher tells you, you're making a free choice. You could be chatting, you could be, I don't know, doodling in the back of your book, but you're actually making a free choice to listen, you're making a free choice to work hard. And so in the same way, the speaker is emphasizing that just as people choose and make a free choice to do the right thing, she's making a free choice to love this man. So it's all about making a free choice to love someone. Okay, I love thee purely as they turn from praise. So in this line, the speaker tells us that her love is pure. And she compares this to turning away from praise. And so let's try and unpick what that means. So sometimes we can be guilty, I guess, of showing love to other people in order to get something back, to earn, to get their praise or to make ourselves feel better. So we love someone because we know we'll get their respect, we'll get their praise, we'll get their admiration in return. But that isn't the kind of love that Barrett Browning is talking about here. She's talking about a selfless love that doesn't have any ulterior motives to it. She's not looking for anything in return. So it's pure, it's selfless. Okay, and then we get to, I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs. Well, as we discussed at the beginning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's life hadn't always been a bed of roses. So let's just recap why. So age 14, she became ill with a lung complaint. When she was 15, she fell off a horse. She gained a spinal injury. Age 22, her mum died. Sort of 10 years later or so, 2 of her brothers died in the same year. So she'd experienced quite a lot of emotional pain and grief, which is perhaps what she is talking about in this line. So when she says, I love thee with a passion put to use in my old griefs, possibly she's saying that all the energy that she used to have, being sad, being bitter, being angry, being devastated about all those difficult things in her past, has now been given a new purpose, and she's able to use that energy to love her partner passionately. So she's turned her old feelings of sadness and distress into feelings of passion and love. Okay, and then finally we've got this bit underlined, childhood's faith. So that phrase reminds us of the way that children believe things in quite an innocent way. So the way that they believe in Santa and the Tooth Fairy. Basically, children are, unless they're really cynical, they trust what they're told. And so Barrett Browning uses this as a way to show us that her love also is innocent and trusting, just like a child's is. Okay, and then we get to, I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. So there's some more religious language in here. And in this line, Elizabeth uses the word saint, which might make us think of Catholic saints who often are made saints for doing quite remarkable things. But Elizabeth wasn't a Catholic, she was a Protestant, and so I don't think she's using the word saint in that way. I think she's using the word saint more in the way that it's defined here. So a person who's a Christian, a person who's good, a person who's kind, someone who's good, who's kind, someone who's a Christian. And so I think the phrase my lost saints actually refers to Elizabeth's mother and her brother Edward who died. So I think they're the lost saints, they're the people who died, people who are good, people who are close to her, people who are Christians. She's now lost. So let's look at this line again with that in mind. So, I love thee with a love I seem to lose with my lost saints. So Elizabeth used to love her mother and brother dearly, but obviously they've died. So what she's saying is that now she loves her partner with the same strength of feeling that she used to love her mother and brother with. Okay. Final lines. I love thee with a breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. So the contrast of smiles and tears reveals that the speaker continues to love her partner in both happy and difficult times. So her love is constant through thick and thin. And then finally, her final claim is that if God lets her, she's going to love her beloved even more intensely after death, which is perhaps an odd feeling, but she's basically claiming that her love, it's not just confined to the here and now, it's eternal, it's going to continue, so strong it's going to continue beyond the moment that she's died. So hopefully you found that helpful, and that is the end of this summary of the poem.